Well, when we talk about mammals, it's actually a pretty small group, but it still can feel pretty big. And so it's nice to take any bigger subject and break it down into smaller bits. And that's just kind of what analysis is. And it certainly makes memorizing things quite a bit easier. I'm going to start with this broad family tree of animals. And the first thing I want to do is to recognize that what we're talking about is a decent sized branch called chordates, things with a backbone. But the 65,000 species of chordates really pales in comparison to the 1.25 million species of invertebrates, ants, octopi, all that sort of stuff. Since this is a terrestrial biology class, we're pretty much going to ignore the branch that makes up fish, although we'll probably talk about salmon just a little bit because they're very important for the state. We'll touch on amphibians, a big branch, 8,000 species, but not our emphasis. We'll come back and talk a little bit about lizards and snakes, probably about one of each. And we'll come back and talk about the dinosaurs. Nope, not these guys that are extinct, but these guys that fly around in trees. So when it comes to mammals, there's about 6,500 species, actually not all that much. And these guys are organized in a few major branches. Monotremes, they're in Australia. That's the duck-billed platypus and stuff like that. Marsupials, we actually have some in the Americas, mainly the Virginia opossum around here, but most of them, like the wallabies and kangaroos, are off in Australia. There's this African group of manatees and elephants and a few others that are kind of strange that we won't deal with. Uh, we don't have monkeys other than, our rambunctious children around here. So we're not going to deal with primates. We will talk about bats just a little bit. There are lots and lots of bats, but they're pretty easy as an order to figure out. So I won't talk about them in detail here. They're the flying mammals, and enough said there. But we will talk about some of the rest of these. Not a tremendously diverse bunch, uh, but Artiodactyls are one where there's quite a few species. Carnivores, they're the big ones that get a lot of attention and are really interesting and kind of sexy. But um, these groups here is kind of what, along with I suppose a lot of the cetaceans, the whales and dolphins and porpoises, is what I'd call the charismatic megafauna. The big stuff that captures our attention. And when we go out in nature, that's what we want to see. That's what photograph you want to bring back from Yellowstone. People aren't too impressed if you come back with a picture of a bunny or a rodent. But rodents, I mean, that's kind of where it's at when it comes to mammals. 2,500 species. I mean, that just makes everything else pale in comparison. So there's the whole family tree, at least of the chordates. Let's take a look at a few of these orders next. Well, first up, we have insectivores, and as their name suggests, they eat insects. Not always just insects, but a lot of times uh, other invertebrates is indicated here. And to do that, they have these sharp little teeth to uh, sort of crush and capture those prey that might get away. Now, since moles and shrews come out at night or live underground, they don't really have very good eyesight. I mean, you can see this guy over here, you can barely make out any eyes on him. And they're all burrowing, and so that's a big feature there, and have pretty small bodies, sometimes reduced features for a lot of their bodies, just so they can get through the ground well, and other times uh, exaggerated features, especially these strong forearms in the case of moles. Um, Certainly less so for shrews, not as big of a burrowing animal, but those are insectivores. Bats used to be placed into this group, but have recognized they're still fairly different, but have a lot of similarities, other than that very obvious wing thing. Weird group that you don't necessarily think of and haven't heard of is the Lagomorphs, and that really just is rabbits and hares and pikas. And so these guys are completely herbivorous, and so they just eat plants. They have four big incisors, those chisel-like teeth in the front that chisel off plant matter. And in the back, they have these big flat molars, and those are for grinding up all that plant matter before they swallow it. And then their eyes are off to their side because they are really easy prey for a lot of other organisms. So, if you're sitting here as this rabbit, you want to be able to see sort of in all directions around you. Um, it's not really important that you use both eyes pointing directly forward, for sort of reading a good book or something like that. So they're more concerned about being able to see everywhere. And you'll see this in most herbivores as well. Um, all these guys have kind of a bad habit, which is to eat their own feces. They produce a special kind, and because they eat pretty tough to digest material, they sometimes digest it twice, and not real nice. That was one of those sort of unsavory bits about the pika. Cute as it is, and as cute as rabbits are, that's something that we probably don't want to talk about a whole lot. Now, rodents, we kind of associate with them with being gross, but this is a small group like this little squirrel here, and rats and mice and these little things called voles that are kind of like mice. Usually, we don't see a lot of these guys. They come out at dawn and dusk. That's what crepuscular means. And you're probably more familiar with nocturnal. Lots of them are nocturnal. Most of them are omnivorous, so they eat all kinds of stuff. And it's these two huge front incisors, right? Those buck teeth. Think of beavers. They have in the front of their mouth those two really big teeth, and then below they have two smaller ones. Um, that kind of looks like a beaver smiling at you right there. And that's for gnawing. They use these as basically their tools. We have opposable thumbs. They have two big incisors. And kind of like the lagomorphs, they have flat molars in the back for grinding up their food, but they eat all kinds of stuff. Quite a few have cheek pouches, especially those that eat seeds. A lot of squirrels do. This extra little flap of skin inside that they can tuck away their food and carry it around because they don't have purses. We haven't talked about this yet, but plantigrade, their footprint looks like ours. They're going to have a heel and the ball of their foot and all their little toes. That's plantigrade. So just like us, gives them a nice stable footing. And quite a few, obviously not the squirrel here, but a lot of them are fossorial, like those insectivores. Uh, but others are arboreal, like this squirrel here. So a pretty diverse group, that is our most diverse group. And their big tool is their teeth. Now, Artiodactyls, ungulates is the other name, and I'll usually call them ungulates, but Artiodactyls, trying to be consistent with some of the resources that I've given you. Um, these are the hoofed animals, and that's what ungulate refers to really, is their hooves. And so these guys are also herbivores, and this is basically a giant fermentation chamber. You're familiar with cattle chewing their cud, and horses do something kind of similar, um, but they ferment all of their food. And so they eat plants. They don't have to be too concerned about um, really seeing their food really well, and so their eyes are on the side of their head, kind of like our rabbit friends, so they can see the carnivores that are probably coming to chase them down, because this is a pretty big prize if you can catch it. So that long abdomen is there for a reason, and because they're often chased down, they have these long, narrow legs that help them run pretty fast. And um, they do have several incisors in the front, those kind of chisel-like teeth, kind of like we have right up front, and those help them nip off their uh, blades of grass and things like that. Some, like in the deer family, actually have eliminated the top teeth and just have this soft palate that make it actually easier for them to nip that vegetation off. Their lower teeth just come and meet that. Um, and of course, big flat molars in the back for grinding up that food before it goes into their stomach. They spend a lot of time eating and chewing, and eating and chewing. And then when they're done with that, then they eat and they chew some more. Because they're kind of vulnerable, they often form herds as part of their mechanism for both reproduction and defense. And usually they're just reproducing once a year. They have a fall rut when they breed, and that times it just right, so they give birth in the spring when all the plants are out and whatnot. And then these guys, their feet are unguligrade. This term ungulate, like I indicated, which is just those two hooves that touch the ground, kind of the tips of their toes, running on their fingernails in a way. But that makes those legs nice and long. And they're not wearing like heavy shoes that are going to slow them down. It's sort of the opposite of that. So that's the Artiodactyls. All right, now for the carnivores. Those big scary guys with sharp pointy teeth. And the sharp teeth are one of their big features, although they don't all eat meat. Um, we probably should call them canines or something like that. Well, we do call some of them canines, and more of that in a minute. Since many of these do eat meat and have to chase that down, their eyes face forward to give them good binocular vision. And you can see how this bear, much more than like if a horse were staring at you, it's just looking right at you. You can tell. And so their eyes have to be up front so they can see what's in front of them with really good depth perception and precision. Now, the bear is not a great example of this, but most of them, at least relative to the artiodactyls, things like deer and elk, have a pretty small abdomen for their body size because their food is easy to digest. Their legs are much shorter and usually more muscular for sprinting, taking down prey, pulling things. In the case of the bear, they're really strong and they can just pull things apart. Now, their feet are digitigrade. It gives them pretty good speed, but a little more stability than running on their tippy toes. And this is kind of like when you sprint, the ball of your foot hits and your toes hit, and that would be a digitigrade type of foot planting pattern when you're sprinting, for example. So then your heel is off the ground, and so they don't have their heel really touch the ground most of the time. Now these guys are pretty protective, and so they are territorial, protecting areas where they might be hunting. And like I said, not all of them are carnivorous. Now there are several groups that are kind of nice to talk about since it is a pretty diverse group. And one is the weasel family. Surprisingly, it's one of the bigger families. And you just think, well, what's in it? Just weasels? Well, of course, weasels, but quite a few others as well. They have some unusual features. These are just massively high strung hunters. They have a really high metabolism, which makes them fast. And so they can chase down their prey with some surprising speed and ferocity. So they have these long, slender bodies typically. They all have pretty pungent anal glands, really lovely thing to think about. And we see it in the skunk. That's a member of the weasel family pretty well. They can even point their anal glands and spray out stuff quite a distance. Most of these guys do have, or they all have anal glands. Very often they just use them for marking territory and whatnot, but that's a pretty dominant feature there. And they have this other really weird feature in terms of their reproduction. They delay their implantation. What does that mean? So they breed, and normally, once animals mate, then the female is pregnant. Well, in this case, they're pregnant for almost a year. I mean, they have like 200-day, 250-day gestation periods, which seems weird, but that's because for a little bit, they're kind of pregnant. So they have the egg here, and the sperm fertilizes the egg. And so now you go to the next stage, and we have this little developing baby, and it might, divide a few times, but then it just stops and it just stays there and waits. And then finally, this will implant in the wall of the uterus, and the animal is pregnant, and then it starts growing and developing into little weaselets. So, kind of strange feature, but that allows them to breed when others are available and give birth in the spring when food is available. And the next two we're really familiar with. Cat family carnivores, so the felines. These guys are like the weasels, obligate carnivores. They have to eat meat. You don't feed your cat vegetables. And these guys have really little stamina. They're just ambush predators. That's why they sleep for like 20 hours a day. And, they'll patrol around now and again and um, wait for their prey and just this huge burst of speed. And those retractable claws are kind of an interesting feature, which means unlike dogs, when cats leave their footprints, their little toes, that's all you see. There's no little claws up above there. The other thing is on these guys, usually one toe is, sorry, it keeps doing that, out front of the other one. And so there's one toe in the middle that comes out a little bit further. I call that the leading toe. And that's one way you can tell cat prints from dog prints, because in dogs, both of these middle toes basically reach the same distance. In terms of mating, one interesting feature here is that mating triggers ovulation. So a lot of times animals go into estrus, they have this ovulation cycle in the females, and they put out hormones that say I'm ready to become pregnant. But in cats, it's the actual act of mating that releases the egg. These guys are also territorial. They mark scent. When your cat rubs on you, it's marking its territory, which it thinks is you and your chair and the walls and whatever else. They're just naturally pretty territorial. So that's the cat family. And then the dog family. They're a little more flexible. They eat a lot of meat, but they're pretty flexible. These guys, unlike cats, have really good stamina. They have, big hearts, big lungs. They can run for a long time. You might be thinking about your little French bulldog and saying, I don't see it. And yeah, it's probably been bred out of them. But the dog family in general um, generally has really good stamina, can run for long distances, and they'll chase down their prey. They do typically live in small family groups, these packs, with one breeding pair of adults, and the others kind of help out. And sometimes that's extended family, and sometimes it's just immediate family groups. And they also mark their territory. Different groups have glands in different places. We'll come back and talk about that. And so I talked about coyotes marking their territory with their scat. And so on the way out, their feces is coated with a little bit of scent from those anal glands, and that's part of how they're marking their territory. All right, so that is the mammals and a rundown on all of them and the different groups. And I hope you mainly just use that to organize information so you're not just memorizing mountains of data on every single species, but realize each one belongs to a group and they have some common characteristics.